They say opportunity knocks only once. In my case, it called me on a Tuesday morning while I was eating a peanut butter sandwich and wondering how I'd pay next month's rent. The voice on the other end of the phone was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Old, raspy, broken, like someone who'd been screaming for years and had nothing left but whispers. "I found you on Instagram," she said, her words crawling through the phone like spiders. "I need an experienced real estate agent to handle rental contracts for my property." I should have hung up right there. Should have told her I was just a kid with a real estate license, barely a year old, still figuring out which end was up in this business. But rent was due in 2 weeks, and my bank account had about enough money in it to buy another jar of peanut butter. So I lied. "You've found the right person," I said, trying to make my voice sound confident and professional. "I've been in this business for years." The woman on the phone made a sound that might have been laughter, but it sounded more like wind blowing through dead leaves. "Perfect," she wheezed. "I live abroad and need someone local to handle things. You won't even need to find tenants. I already have a waiting list of people interested in the property." That should have been my second red flag. Properties with waiting lists don't need rookie agents. They don't need agents at all, really. But then she mentioned my commission, and I nearly choked on my sandwich. "Could you repeat that number?" I asked, certain I'd misheard. She repeated it slowly, each digit falling like a hammer blow. It was more money than I'd made in the past 6 months combined, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. "That amount will be delivered to you in cash as soon as each tenant signs and moves in," she continued. "There's only one condition. If a contract is broken due to your negligence or choice, you'll owe me 1 month's rent as compensation." I did the math in my head. Even if I screwed up and had to pay the penalty, I'd still come out ahead, way ahead. "I accept," I said without hesitation. "Excellent. I'll text you the address. Go see the property tomorrow. The first tenants will meet you there at 2 p.m. The line went dead before I could ask any questions. Not that I had many. Money talks loud enough to drown out most concerns. The next day, I drove out to see the property, following GPS directions that led me further and further from civilization. The house sat at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. There were no neighbors in sight, no other houses, nothing but trees stretching endlessly in every direction. The house itself was impressive, a large 2-story structure that looked like it had been pulled from the pages of an architecture magazine. Expensive hardwood floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers. The furniture was all solid wood, heavy pieces that probably cost more than my car. Sculptures and art installations decorated every room, the kind of stuff you see in museums behind velvet ropes. But what really caught my attention was the back porch. It opened onto a stunning view of the forest, with large wooden chairs positioned to face the woods. There was something almost ceremonial about how they were arranged, like they were waiting for something to emerge from between the trees. I could picture myself there in 30 years, retired, drinking coffee and watching birds. It was the kind of view people paid millions for. The first tenants arrived exactly at 2 p.m., an elderly couple named Harold and Martha. They were in their 70s, tired of city life and looking for peace in their golden years. Harold walked with a cane, and Martha kept commenting on how clean the air smelled. "We've been looking for a place like this for months," Martha said, running her hand along the smooth banister of the main staircase. "Somewhere quiet, where we can just exist without all the noise and chaos." They loved everything about the house, especially the view from the back porch. Harold sat in one of the wooden chairs and closed his eyes, breathing deeply. "This is it, Martha. This is where we belong." They signed the contract without even reading it through. I should have found that strange, but I was too focused on the commission that would soon be mine. As they shook my hand and promised to move in the next day, I felt like I'd finally caught my big break. I went home that evening, torn between excitement and anxiety. Would the mysterious landlady really pay me that much money? It seemed too good to be true, and in my experience, things that seemed too good to be true usually were. But 3 days later, a black suitcase appeared on my doorstep. Inside were stacks of $100 bills, rubber-banded together like something out of a movie. I counted it twice, then a third time, hardly believing what I was seeing. It was all there, every penny. Strange? Yes. Strange enough to stop me from trading it in for a new car? Absolutely not. About a month later, the landlady called again. Her raspy voice crackled through the phone like static electricity. "Harold and Martha didn't work out," she said simply. "New tenants want to see the house today at 3 p.m. I wanted to ask what she meant by "didn't work out," but she'd already hung up. Part of me was curious about what had happened to the elderly couple, but a bigger part of me was excited about another easy commission. The new tenants were 2 women named Sarah and Lisa, a couple who'd been together for 5 years. Sarah was a writer looking for inspiration for her next novel, and Lisa was a photographer interested in capturing the changing seasons of the forest. "There's something magical about this place," Sarah said, standing on the back porch and staring into the woods. "I can feel the stories just waiting to be told." Lisa was already taking pictures, her camera clicking rapidly as she captured different angles of the house and surrounding landscape. "The light here is incredible," she murmured. "It's like the forest is alive." They signed as quickly as Harold and Martha had, and once again a suitcase full of money appeared on my doorstep a few days later. I was starting to get used to this routine, and honestly, it was the best job I'd ever had. Easy money, minimal work, and clients who seemed to sell themselves on the property. But a month later, the phone rang again. "Sarah and Lisa have moved on," the landlady wheezed. "We have another interested party." This time I couldn't help myself. "What do you mean they moved on? Is there something wrong with the house? Why does everyone leave so quickly?" The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I thought she'd hung up. Then came that sound again. Not quite laughter, not quite coughing, but something in between. "People come and go," she said finally. "That's the nature of rental properties, don't you think?" Before I could respond, she was giving me details about the next showing. I hung up feeling unsettled, but still motivated by the prospect of another fat commission. The third tenant was different from the others. He was pale, thin, covered in tattoos that snaked up both arms like dark vines. A large silver piercing hung from his left ear, catching the light as he moved. He walked slowly, deliberately, like every step caused him pain. "I need this place," he told me, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to get away from my past, start over somewhere clean." I didn't ask for details. In this business, you learn not to pry into people's personal lives. But there was something about him that made me uncomfortable, a darkness that seemed to follow him around like a shadow. What really captured his attention was the view from the back porch. He stood there for a long time, staring into the forest with an intensity that was almost frightening. His hands gripped the railing so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is perfect," he said finally. "When can I move in?" He signed the contract immediately, and the next day his moving truck was parked in the driveway. I watched from my car as he and 2 helpers carried box after box into the house. Furniture, personal belongings, enough stuff to fill the place completely. 2 weeks later, I realized I'd left some important documents at the house. I called the tenant. His name was Marcus, but got no answer. I tried several more times throughout the day, but the phone just rang and rang. Finally, I decided to drive out there and retrieve the documents myself. It was a beautiful afternoon, and the drive through the forest was peaceful, but as I pulled up to the house, something felt wrong. Marcus's car wasn't in the driveway, which was odd, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe he'd gone into town for supplies. But when I rang the doorbell, no one answered. The house felt empty, abandoned. I tried the front door and found it unlocked. That was my first real warning that something was seriously wrong. Who leaves their house unlocked in the middle of nowhere? "Marcus!" I called out as I stepped inside. "It's me, your agent. I just need to grab some papers." No response. The house was silent, except for the sound of my own footsteps echoing off the hardwood floors. But as I looked around, my confusion turned to shock, then to disbelief. The house was completely empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. No furniture, no belongings, no trace that anyone had ever lived there. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and my footsteps left marks on the dusty floor. It was exactly as it had been when I first showed it to Harold and Martha months ago. I stood in the middle of the living room trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I had watched Marcus and his helpers carry dozens of boxes into this house. I had seen furniture, appliances, personal belongings. Where had it all gone? I searched every room, every closet, looking for some sign that Marcus had ever been there. Nothing. It was as if the past month had been a dream, as if I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The commission checks were real. The money in my bank account was real. So where was everything else? I was about to leave, convinced that I was losing my mind, when I decided to check the back porch one more time. Maybe Marcus had left something there, some clue about where he'd gone or what had happened. The wooden chairs were still arranged facing the forest, exactly as they'd always been. I sat down in one of them, trying to think, trying to piece together what could possibly explain what I'd seen, or rather what I hadn't seen. That's when I noticed something glinting in a crack between the wooden slats of the chair. I reached down and worked it free. It was Marcus's ear piercing. The large silver ring he'd worn in his left ear. But it wasn't just the piercing that made my blood run cold. It was the dark red stain on the metal. Fresh blood. My hand was shaking as I reached back into the crack, feeling around for anything else that might be hidden there. My fingers touched something soft, something that definitely didn't belong. I pulled it out and immediately wished I hadn't. It was an ear. Human ear. Dark, rotting, with a ragged hole where the piercing had been torn out. I dropped it and stumbled backward, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But as I stared at the gruesome thing lying on the porch floor, I knew it was real. And I knew Marcus hadn't just moved away. I should have left right then, should have run to my car and never looked back. But something compelled me to investigate further. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was the need to understand what I'd gotten myself into. Either way, I found myself trying to move the heavy wooden chair to see what might be underneath it. The chair was incredibly heavy, much heavier than it looked. It took all my strength to push it just a few inches to the side, but that was enough. Carved into the wooden floor beneath the chair was a symbol unlike anything I'd ever seen. It looked ancient, ritualistic, a complex pattern of circles and lines that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, even though they were just scratches in wood. Dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood filled the carved grooves. I stared at the symbol, my mind racing. This wasn't random. This wasn't some sick joke. This was something planned, something deliberate, something that had been waiting here long before I'd ever heard of this house. As the full horror of what I was looking at began to sink in, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. Laughter. It started as a single voice, distant and barely audible, echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. A woman's laugh, but not the kind you hear at parties or comedy shows. This was different, wild, unhinged, filled with a kind of joy that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with madness. Then other voices joined in. More women, all laughing, all getting closer. It sounded like an entire crowd was hidden in the trees, all of them laughing at some private joke, all of them laughing at me. The sound grew louder, more intense, until it felt like the laughter was coming from everywhere at once. Above me, below me, inside my own head. It was the sound of predators who had just cornered their prey. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run. I stumbled off the porch, sprinted to my car, and fumbled with the keys as the laughter continued to echo through the forest. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I tore down the dirt road, my headlights cutting through the gathering dusk, the laughter followed me. Even after I reached the main road and the forest fell behind, I could still hear it in my head. Dozens of voices, all female, all insane with glee. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that symbol carved into the floor, felt that rotting ear in my hand, heard that horrible laughter echoing through the darkness. By morning, I'd made my decision. The next scheduled tenants were a young couple with a newborn baby. When they called to confirm the appointment, I told them the house was no longer available. I made up some excuse about property damage and cancelled the showing. They weren't happy, but I didn't care. Whatever was happening at that house, I wasn't going to be responsible for putting a family with a baby at risk. My phone rang an hour later. The landlady's raspy voice crackled through the speaker like nails on a chalkboard. "You broke our agreement," she said simply. "The penalty clause is now in effect. You owe me 1 month's rent. Payment is due at the end of this month." "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "there's something wrong with that house. I found evidence that something happened to Marcus, the last tenant. I think we should involve the police." That sound again. Not quite laughter, not quite coughing. "The police?" she wheezed. "What would you tell them? That you found a piece of jewelry and some organic matter? Do you really think they'd believe such a fantastic story?" Before I could respond, she continued, "Payment is due in 7 days. If you fail to pay, we'll be forced to collect through alternative methods." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. The amount she was demanding was more than I had, more than I could get without selling everything I owned. And something about the way she'd said alternative methods made my skin crawl. I tried calling her back, but the number was disconnected. Over the next few days, calls came from different numbers, sometimes with area codes I didn't recognize, sometimes with no caller ID at all. Every time I answered, it was the same raspy voice repeating the same message. "Payment is due, 7 days, alternative methods." I stopped answering unknown calls, but they kept coming. My voicemail filled up with the same wheezing voice, sometimes speaking, sometimes just breathing, sometimes making that horrible not-quite laughter sound. Desperate, I went to the police. The desk sergeant looked like he'd rather be anywhere else as I tried to explain what had happened. I told him about the house, the disappearing tenants, the ear I'd found, the carved symbol. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that you found a human ear on a porch, and when you went back with officers it was gone?" "I didn't go back with officers," I said. "You haven't sent anyone to investigate yet." He sighed heavily. "Sir, we get calls like this all the time. Someone thinks they've seen something supernatural, or they're involved in some kind of conspiracy. Usually it's drugs or mental illness." "I'm not on drugs, and I'm not crazy," I insisted. "Something is happening at that house. People are disappearing." "Then file a missing persons report," he said. "Give us names, social security numbers, last known addresses. We'll look into it through proper channels." But that was the problem. I didn't have any of that information. The landlady had handled all the background checks, all the paperwork. All I had were first names and signatures on contracts that I was beginning to suspect were completely fake. The sergeant gave me a form to fill out and told me someone would call if they needed more information. I knew they never would. 2 officers did eventually drive out to the house, but they found nothing. No ear, no carved symbol, no evidence that anything unusual had ever happened there. They came back irritated, convinced I'd wasted their time with a prank call or a drug-induced hallucination. "The place is clean as a whistle," one of them told me. "Nice house, actually. Whoever owns it keeps it in great condition." I wanted to scream. I wanted to drag them back there and force them to move that chair to look closer, to see what I had seen. But I knew it would be useless. Whatever was happening at that house, it was beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. With 3 days left until the deadline, I made another decision. I packed everything I owned into my car and drove to a cheap motel 3 states away. If I couldn't pay what she was demanding, at least I could make it harder for her to find me. The Sunset Inn was exactly the kind of place where people go to disappear, a run-down roadside motel with peeling paint and a neon sign that flickered on and off all night. I paid cash for a week and settled in to wait. But even there, 300 miles away from that cursed house, I wasn't safe from the nightmares. Every night, I dreamed of the forest. In my dreams, I was sitting in one of those wooden chairs, unable to move, unable to look away from the trees. And from between the branches, figures emerged. Harold and Martha, Sarah and Lisa, Marcus with his torn ear and bloody face. They walked toward me slowly, their eyes empty, their mouths open in silent screams. Behind them came others. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all the tenants who had come before, all the people who had fallen victim to whatever malevolent force controlled that house. They reached out with rotting hands, their fingers stretching toward me like the branches of dead trees, and above it all that laughter, always that horrible, insane laughter echoing through the darkness. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give out. The other motel guests started complaining about the noise. The desk clerk gave me warning looks every time I walked past. But the worst part wasn't the nightmares. The worst part was that even awake, even in the harsh fluorescent light of the motel room, I could still hear the laughter. Faint, distant, but unmistakably real. It followed me everywhere, to the diner down the road, to the gas station, to the convenience store where I bought instant coffee and stale sandwiches. She had found me. Somehow, impossibly, the thing that owned that house had reached across 3 states to claim me. On the night the payment was due, I sat in my motel room with all the lights on, waiting. I'd tried to come up with the money, called everyone I knew, applied for every loan I could think of, even considered selling my car. But it wasn't enough. I was still thousands of dollars short. At exactly midnight, my phone rang. I stared at it for a long moment, knowing who it would be, knowing what she would say. Finally, I answered. "Time's up," she wheezed. "You've had your chance to honor our agreement." "Please," I said, my voice cracking. "I tried to get the money. I'll keep trying. Just give me more time." That horrible not laughter filled the line. "Time is a luxury you no longer possess," she said. "But don't worry. We'll be collecting our payment very soon." The line went dead, and the room fell silent, except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. I sat there waiting, expecting something to happen immediately. But minutes passed, then hours, and nothing changed. Maybe she was bluffing, I told myself. Maybe there was nothing she could actually do to me. Maybe I was safe as long as I stayed away from that house. I was wrong. The laughter started around 3 a.m., faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It seemed to be coming from outside, from the parking lot, from the empty highway that stretched endlessly in both directions. I went to the window and peered through the blinds, but there was nothing there, just my car and the darkness beyond. But the laughter continued, and now I could hear footsteps, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, walking across the asphalt outside, the sound of feet dragging across pavement, shuffling closer and closer to my room. I pressed my face against the window, desperate to see what was out there. For a moment the parking lot was empty, then shapes began to emerge from the darkness, indistinct at first, like shadows given form. But as they drew closer, I could see them more clearly. It was them, all of them, Harold and Martha walking hand in hand, their faces pale and lifeless. Sarah and Lisa, their cameras hanging useless around their necks. Marcus, his ear torn and bloody, his tattoos seeming to writhe in the dim light from the motel sign, and behind them more figures than I could count, men and women of all ages, all wearing the same expression of empty-eyed horror. All of them had been tenants of that house. All of them had sat in those wooden chairs and stared into the forest. All of them had disappeared. Now they surrounded my motel room, pressing their faces against the windows, their dead eyes staring at me with accusation and hunger. They began to scratch at the glass with fingernails that were too long, too sharp. The sound was like chalk on a blackboard, like metal scraping against stone. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. This couldn't be real. This had to be another nightmare. But the scratching continued, and now I could hear them trying the door handle, pushing against the thin wood that was the only thing standing between me and whatever they had become. The laughter grew louder, more frenzied, and beneath it I heard something else. A voice I recognized, though I'd never heard it speak with such authority, such power. "Open the door," the landlady's voice commanded from somewhere beyond the crowd of the dead. "It's time to complete our transaction." The motel room door began to shake in its frame as dozens of hands pounded against it from the outside. The cheap wood splintered and cracked under the assault. I knew it wouldn't hold much longer. In desperation, I grabbed my phone and called 911, but the line was dead. No signal, no dial tone, nothing. I was completely cut off from the outside world. The scratching at the windows intensified, and I could see the glass beginning to web with hairline cracks. Soon they would break through, and then I didn't want to think about what would happen then. But even as terror consumed me, part of my mind was working, trying to understand what was happening. These people, Harold, Martha, Sarah, Lisa, Marcus, and all the others, they hadn't just disappeared. They had become something else, something trapped between life and death. And somehow the house was the key to it all. The pounding on the door stopped suddenly, and the parking lot fell silent. For a moment I dared to hope that whatever had summoned these spirits had given up, moved on to easier prey. Then I heard a key turning in the lock. The door swung open slowly, and she walked in. The landlady was not what I had expected. I had imagined someone old and frail, someone whose raspy voice came from age and illness. But the woman who entered my motel room was ageless, beautiful in a way that was both alluring and terrifying. Her skin was pale as moonlight, her hair dark as the depths of the forest. Her eyes were black holes that seemed to swallow light. "Hello," she said, and her voice was no longer raspy or broken. It was smooth, melodious, hypnotic. "We need to talk." The army of the dead remained outside, motionless now, waiting for her command. She closed the door behind her and took a seat in the room's single chair, crossing her legs with casual elegance. "You're probably wondering what this is all about," she continued. "Why the house? Why the tenants? Why you?" I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "What are you?" She smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "I'm old," she said simply. "Older than this country, older than the forests that once covered this continent from coast to coast. I was here when your ancestors were still crossing oceans in wooden ships, and I'll be here long after your kind has turned to dust. The house is mine, yes, has always been mine. The land beneath it is sacred, soaked in blood and offerings that go back thousands of years. Your people built over it without understanding what they were disturbing." She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the assembled spirits with something that might have been affection. "They come to me seeking peace, seeking escape from their troubles, and I give them exactly what they ask for. You kill them. I transform them," she corrected. "Death is just the beginning. They become part of something greater, something eternal. They feed the forest, nourish the earth, serve a purpose far beyond their small, meaningless lives." "And me?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "You're the harvester," she said, turning back to face me. "You bring them to me one by one. You make the process easier, less messy than hunting them down myself." "I didn't know," I protested. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Her laughter filled the room. Not the horrible cackling I'd heard in the forest, but something worse, something that sounded almost human. "Ignorance is not innocence," she said. "You took money for delivering souls to slaughter. Your motives were pure greed." "I'll stop," I said desperately. I'll never go back there. I'll never bring anyone else to that house." "Oh, but you will," she said with certainty, "because if you don't, I'll collect what you owe me in other ways, starting with everyone you've ever cared about." Images flashed through my mind. My parents, my sister, my few friends. I saw them sitting in those wooden chairs, staring into the forest with empty eyes, waiting for whatever horror would claim them. "1 tenant per month," she continued. "That's our new arrangement. Bring them to me willingly and I'll forgive your debt. Refuse, and watch everyone you love join my collection." I wanted to fight back, to refuse, to find some way out of the trap I'd walked into. But as I looked into her black eyes, I knew there was no escape. She was offering me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. "How do I know you'll keep your word?" I asked. "How do I know you won't just kill them anyway once I've served your purpose?" "Because I need you," she said simply. "The old ways are harder now. People are suspicious, connected, harder to isolate. But you're legitimate. You have credentials, references, a reason to bring people to remote places. You make my work so much easier." She reached into her purse and pulled out a new contract, written on paper that looked ancient and felt wrong to the touch. The text was in English, but the words seemed to shift and crawl as I tried to read them. "1 tenant per month," she repeated. "Delivered to the house, signed and moved in. In return, your debt is forgiven, your commission continues, and your loved ones remain safe. And if I refuse," she gestured toward the window where the spirits still waited in the parking lot, "then you join them tonight, and I find another harvester, someone with less scruples and fewer questions." My hand trembled as I took the pen she offered. The metal was cold, so cold it almost burned my fingers. I looked at the contract one more time, searching for some loophole, some way out. There wasn't one. I signed my name at the bottom, and the paper seemed to absorb the ink like blood soaking into cloth. The moment I finished the last letter, the spirits outside began to fade, dissolving back into the darkness from which they'd come. "Excellent," she said, taking the contract and storing it carefully in her purse. "Your first assignment will come next week. A middle-aged man looking for a quiet place to write his memoirs. He'll find the house very inspiring." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at me. "Oh, and one more thing. Don't try to warn them. The contract prevents it. Any attempt to sabotage our arrangement will result in immediate forfeiture of our agreement." With that, she was gone, vanishing into the night as suddenly as she'd appeared. I was alone in the motel room once again, but everything had changed. I was no longer a victim. I was a collaborator. I was part of the machine that fed that hungry house. I drove back to my apartment the next morning, my mind numb with the weight of what I'd agreed to. Part of me hoped it had all been a nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much caffeine and too little sleep. But when I got home, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. The voice was male, middle-aged, friendly. He said he'd gotten my number from a rental listing and was interested in seeing a property outside the city, somewhere quiet, where he could work on his book without distractions. His name was David Mitchell, and he would be my first willing sacrifice to whatever lived in that forest. I spent the next 3 days in agony, trying to think of some way to warn him without violating the contract I'd signed. But every time I started to dial his number or write an email, my hand would freeze. The words would die in my throat. Some invisible force prevented me from speaking the truth. The contract was more than just paper and ink. It was a binding that reached into my very soul. When the day came to meet David at the house, I drove there feeling like I was attending my own execution. He was waiting in the driveway when I arrived. A pleasant-looking man in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Beautiful spot," he said, shaking my hand with genuine enthusiasm. "I can already feel the creative energy here." I wanted to scream at him to run, to get in his car and drive as far away as possible. Instead, I heard myself saying, "Wait until you see the view from the back porch." We went through the familiar routine. I showed him the rooms, the amenities, the expensive furniture that would vanish the moment he signed the contract. He loved everything about the place, but like all the others, what really sold him was the forest view. "This is perfect," he said, settling into one of the wooden chairs. "I can picture myself here every morning, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise through the trees." He signed the contract with a flourish, his excitement palpable. As I watched him write his name, I felt a piece of my humanity die. I was no longer just a victim of the thing that controlled this house. I was its willing servant. "When can I move in?" David asked. "Tomorrow," I replied, my voice hollow. "The movers can start first thing in the morning." David moved in the next day, just as Harold and Martha had, just as Sarah and Lisa had, just as Marcus had. I watched from my car as he and the moving crew carried boxes and furniture into the house, knowing that in a month it would all be gone, knowing that David would be gone too. The commission arrived 3 days later, just as it always had. Another suitcase full of cash, another payment for services rendered. I stared at the money, remembering how excited I'd been when I received the first payment. Now it felt like blood money, which I supposed it was. A month passed. David's phone stopped working. When I drove out to check on him, the house was empty again, clean and dusty, as if no one had ever lived there. Another human being had vanished without a trace, and I had made it possible. But I didn't find any trace of him this time. No jewelry, no body parts, no evidence of what had happened. The thing that owned this house had learned to be more careful, more thorough. Or perhaps David's remains were feeding the roots of the trees that surrounded the property, becoming part of the forest itself. The cycle continued. Every month, a new tenant. Every month, a new victim. A retired teacher looking for a peaceful place to tend her garden. A young artist seeking inspiration for his paintings. A divorced father wanting to start over after a bitter custody battle. They all loved the house, they all signed eagerly, and they all disappeared exactly 30 days later. With each new tenant, I died a little more inside. I stopped sleeping through the night, haunted by dreams of the forest and the faces of the people I'd condemned. I started drinking, trying to numb the guilt that ate at me like acid, but nothing helped. Nothing could wash away the stain of what I'd become. I tried to research the history of the property, hoping to find some clue about how to break the curse that bound me. The land had changed hands dozens of times over the past century, but every owner had sold quickly, often at a loss. Most of the records were vague, mentioning only that the families had relocated unexpectedly or decided to pursue other opportunities. But I found one newspaper clipping from 1987 that made my blood run cold. An entire family, parents, 3 children and a grandmother, had vanished from the property overnight. Their car was still in the driveway, their belongings untouched, but they were never seen again. The investigation went nowhere. The case was eventually classified as a missing persons matter and forgotten. How many others had there been? How many families, how many individuals had fallen victim to the hunger of that ancient thing? And how many real estate agents like me had served as its unwitting accomplices over the decades? I was trapped in a web of horror that stretched back generations, maybe centuries, and there was no way out. 6 months into my new arrangement, I reached my breaking point. The latest victim was supposed to be a young woman named Jennifer, a recent college graduate looking for an affordable place to start her career as a freelance graphic designer. She was 22 years old, full of hope and ambition, excited about her future. She reminded me of my sister. As I drove to meet her at the house, my hands shook so violently I could barely grip the steering wheel. I pulled over twice, fighting waves of nausea that threatened to overwhelm me. By the time I reached the property, I was a wreck. Jennifer was already there, taking photos of the exterior with her phone. She was everything I'd expected. Young, beautiful, radiant, with the kind of optimism that only comes from never having experienced real darkness. "This place is incredible," she said, bouncing on her toes with excitement. "It's like something out of a fairy tale." A fairy tale. If only she knew what kind. I led her through the house mechanically, pointing out features and amenities while my mind screamed at me to stop, to find some way to save her. But the contract's hold on me was absolute. I couldn't speak the words of warning that might have saved her life. We reached the back porch, and I watched her face light up as she saw the forest view. She walked to the wooden chairs and ran her hand along the smooth armrest of the one where I'd found Marcus's ear. "This is where I'll set up my workspace," she said dreamily. "Can you imagine the inspiration I'll find here? The peace and quiet? Peace and quiet." She had no idea that the silence of this place was the silence of the grave. "I'll take it," she said without hesitation. "Where do I sign?" I handed her the contract with trembling fingers, and she signed it with the same enthusiasm she'd shown for everything else. As she wrote her name, I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't save her. The contract prevented that, but maybe I could save the next one. That night, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of whiskey and a laptop, crafting the most important document I'd ever written. If I couldn't warn my victims directly, maybe I could find another way to expose the truth. I wrote everything down, every detail about the house, the disappearances, the thing that masqueraded as a landlady. I described the ritual symbols carved into the porch floor, the laughter in the forest, the army of spirits that had surrounded my motel room. I included names, dates, every piece of evidence I could remember. It was a confession, a warning, and a plea for help all rolled into one. When I finished, I uploaded it to every horror forum and paranormal investigation website I could find. I sent copies to local newspapers, television stations, and police departments. I even mailed printed versions to random addresses, hoping that someone, somewhere, would take it seriously. Most people dismissed it as fiction, the product of an overactive imagination, or someone looking for attention online. But a few believed. A few started asking questions. One of them was Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of folklore and mythology at the State University. She'd been researching indigenous legends of the region and found striking parallels between my story and ancient tribal warnings about a hunger spirit that lived in the deep forest. She contacted me through an encrypted email account, asking for more details. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. Dr. Chen assembled a small team of researchers and paranormal investigators to look into my claims. They included a historian who specialized in pre-Columbian cultures, a psychic investigator with decades of experience, and a documentary filmmaker who'd made his name exposing supernatural frauds. They were skeptical at first, naturally, but as they dug deeper into the history of the property, they began to uncover evidence that supported my story. The land had been sacred to the local indigenous tribe for over 1,000 years. They'd considered it cursed, a place where evil spirits gathered to feed on human suffering. European settlers had ignored these warnings and built their homes there anyway, with predictably tragic results. Over the centuries, dozens of families had vanished from properties built on that cursed ground. The disappearances had been covered up, explained away, or simply forgotten by authorities who didn't want to deal with cases they couldn't solve. But Dr. Chen and her team were different. They weren't interested in covering anything up. They wanted the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. They began surveillance of the house, using high-tech equipment to monitor electromagnetic fields, temperature fluctuations, and other phenomena that might indicate supernatural activity. They also started following the paper trail of property ownership, tracing the mysterious landlady through shell companies and fake identities. What they found was disturbing. The same woman, or something wearing the same face, had been buying and selling that property for over a century. The photographs in old real estate documents showed her looking exactly the same in 1923 as she had when she first called me. She wasn't human. She never had been. 3 weeks after Jennifer had moved into the house, Dr. Chen's team was ready to make their move. They'd gathered enough evidence to convince local authorities to take action, and they'd developed a plan to confront the entity that controlled the property. But they were too late. Jennifer had already vanished, just like all the others. When we arrived at the house, it was empty and clean, showing no sign that anyone had ever lived there. The cycle had completed itself once again. I stood on that accursed porch, looking at the wooden chairs that had witnessed so much horror, and felt the weight of another death on my soul. Jennifer was gone, consumed by the thing I served, and it was my fault. But Dr. Chen wasn't interested in my guilt. She was focused on the task at hand. "Show me where you found the symbol," she said, pulling out a strange device that looked like a combination metal detector and Geiger counter. I pointed to the chair where I'd discovered Marcus's ear, and she began scanning the area with her instrument. The device immediately began beeping frantically, its LED display flashing warnings in red. "There's incredible energy concentrated here," she murmured, "like nothing I've ever encountered." We moved the chair together, revealing the carved symbol underneath. But this time, it was different. The grooves were deeper, darker, and they seemed to pulse with their own malevolent light. "It's getting stronger," Dr. Chen said grimly. "Each feeding makes it more powerful." The psychic investigator, a woman named Maria Santos, knelt beside the symbol and placed her hands just above its surface. Immediately, her eyes rolled back, and she began to speak in a voice that wasn't her own. "So many souls," she said, her words echoing strangely in the afternoon air. "Centuries of feeding. The hunger grows with each offering." "Can it be stopped?" Dr. Chen asked. Maria's possessed voice laughed, a sound that was sickeningly familiar. "The harvest will continue. The covenant is eternal. The marked one will bring more." She was talking about me. I was the marked one, bound by the contract I'd signed to keep delivering victims to this creature. But Maria wasn't finished. "Unless," she said, her voice trailing off. "Unless what?" Dr. Chen pressed. "The willing sacrifice of the harvester," Maria whispered. "The one who breaks the chain by offering himself." That evening, back at Dr. Chen's university office, we discussed what Maria had revealed during her psychic episode. The entity that controlled the house was indeed ancient, possibly pre-human, and it fed on the life force of its victims. But according to the folklore Dr. Chen had researched, there was a way to break the cycle. In many indigenous traditions, she explained, a spirit can only be bound by willing participation. If the person who's been helping it chooses to sacrifice themselves willingly, it breaks the contract and weakens the entity significantly. "But it doesn't destroy it?" I asked. "No," she admitted, "but it would force it into a dormant state for decades, maybe centuries, long enough for the site to be properly cleansed and protected." The filmmaker in the group, a man named David Park, had been recording everything. "This is incredible," he said. "If we can document this, if we can prove that supernatural forces are real." "People will die," I interrupted. "More people will vanish while you're making your documentary and winning your awards." Dr. Chen put a hand on my shoulder. "That's why we need to act quickly, but the choice has to be yours. We can't force you to sacrifice yourself." I thought about Jennifer, about her excited smile as she signed her death warrant. I thought about David Mitchell and all the others who trusted me to help them find a home, only to deliver them to their doom. How many more would suffer if I didn't act? "What would I have to do?" I asked. "Go back to the house," Dr. Chen said. "Sit in that chair where the symbol is carved. Call out to the entity and offer yourself as a willing sacrifice to end the cycle. And then?" She looked uncomfortable. "Then you die, but your death would have meaning. It would save countless future victims." It wasn't much of a choice, really. Continue serving as the creature's harvester, condemning innocent people to horrible deaths month after month, or end my own life to break the chain. When I put it like that, there was only one right answer. We returned to the house at midnight, when the barrier between worlds was supposed to be thinnest. Dr. Chen and her team set up their equipment at a safe distance while I walked alone to the back porch. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No insects, no nightbirds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if the very presence of the entity had driven all natural life away from this cursed place. I sat down in the wooden chair, feeling the carved symbol beneath my feet. The wood seemed to pulse with warmth, as if it were alive, as if it were eager for what was to come. "I know you can hear me," I called out to the darkness. "I'm here to make you an offer." The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath began to fog, and frost formed on the porch railing despite the warm summer night. Something was coming. She emerged from the forest slowly, her pale form gliding between the trees like mist. But she was different now. Larger, more terrible, her beauty twisted into something alien and predatory. Her eyes were black holes that seemed to swallow light, and her smile revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. "You're early," she said, her voice carrying the sound of wind through dead leaves. "The next tenant isn't scheduled to arrive for another week." "I'm not here about the next tenant," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm here to offer myself." She paused, tilting her head like a predator studying prey. "Yourself? How unexpected. And why would you do such a thing?" "To end this," I said. "To break the contract. To stop you from killing anyone else." Her laughter filled the forest, echoing off the trees until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oh, my dear harvester, you think your death will stop me? I've had dozens of harvesters over the centuries. When one dies, I simply find another." My heart sank. Had Dr. Chen been wrong? Would my sacrifice accomplish nothing? But then I remembered something Maria had said during her possession. The willing sacrifice of the harvester, the one who breaks the chain by offering himself. "I'm not just offering to die," I said, standing up from the chair. "I'm offering to take their place, all of them. Every person I brought here, every soul you've consumed through me. Let me bear that weight." The creature's expression changed, becoming something between surprise and hunger. "Interesting," she said. "You would take on the suffering of all your victims, their fear, their pain, their despair, for eternity?" I thought of Jennifer's bright smile, of David Mitchell's enthusiasm, of Harold and Martha holding hands as they explored their dream home. "Yes," I said, "I'll take it all." "Then step into the circle," she commanded. I looked down and saw that the carved symbol was glowing now, pulsing with an eerie green light that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The lines and circles had expanded, growing larger and more complex, forming a ritual circle that encompassed the entire porch. As I stepped into the center of the symbol, I felt a change come over me. The air grew thick, almost viscous, and I could hear voices whispering at the edge of perception, the voices of the victims, calling out in languages I didn't recognize, telling me their stories of fear and regret. The entity circled me slowly, her form shifting and changing with each step. Sometimes she appeared as the beautiful woman who'd visited my motel room. Sometimes she was something ancient and terrible, all claws and teeth and burning eyes. And sometimes she was nothing more than a shadow, a void in the shape of hunger. "Do you understand what you're agreeing to?" she asked. "Not just death, but eternal torment. You'll feel every moment of terror your victims experienced. You'll live through their final agonies over and over, forever." I closed my eyes and nodded. "I understand." "Then speak the words of binding." Somehow I knew what to say. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, in a language that predated human civilization. As I spoke them, the symbol beneath my feet blazed brighter, and I felt something fundamental shift in the fabric of reality. The contract that had bound me to serve the entity was breaking, but something new was taking its place. A deeper binding, one written in blood and suffering and the weight of innocent souls. Pain exploded through my body as the ritual reached its climax. I felt my life force being drained away, but more than that, I felt the accumulated suffering of everyone who had died in this place flooding into me. Their fear became my fear, their pain became my pain, their despair became my despair. But there was something else, something unexpected. As I accepted their suffering, I also felt their forgiveness. Jennifer smiled at me one last time, her young face radiant with understanding. David Mitchell nodded approvingly, proud that his death had served a purpose. Harold and Martha took my hands, their touch warm despite the cold of the grave. "Thank you," they whispered in unison. "Thank you for setting us free." The entity let out a shriek of rage and frustration as she felt her power being stripped away. The souls she had consumed for centuries were being released, their energy turned against her. She clawed at me desperately, trying to stop the ritual, but it was too late. "This isn't over," she hissed as her form began to dissolve. "I'll find another way, another harvester. This is just a setback." "Maybe," I said, my voice growing weaker as my life ebbed away. "But it's a start." I died that night on the cursed porch, but my death accomplished what I'd hoped. The entity was banished, sent back to whatever dark realm had spawned it centuries ago. The house stood empty for the first time in generations, truly empty, free of the malevolent presence that had turned it into a trap for the innocent. Dr. Chen and her team documented everything, creating a record of what had happened that would serve as a warning for future generations. The property was eventually bought by the state and turned into a nature preserve with strict rules preventing any construction or development on the cursed land. But my story doesn't end with my death. I exist now in the spaces between worlds, a guardian spirit watching over the place where so much horror occurred. I can feel the entity stirring sometimes, testing the barriers that keep it imprisoned, looking for weaknesses it can exploit. And I know that someday it will find a way back. These ancient hungers are patient, persistent. They can wait decades, centuries if necessary, for the right moment to return. When that time comes, when some unfortunate soul receives a phone call from a woman with a raspy voice offering easy money for simple work, I'll be there to warn them. I'll whisper in their dreams, leave signs they can't ignore, do whatever it takes to prevent the cycle from beginning again, because some prices are too high to pay, some deals too terrible to make, and some houses should remain empty forever. The forest is quiet now, peaceful in a way it hasn't been for centuries. Birds sing in the trees, and small animals scurry through the underbrush without fear. The wooden chairs still sit on the back porch, but they're just furniture now, nothing more. Sometimes hikers find the place despite the restrictions, drawn by stories they've heard or an inexplicable urge to explore. I watch them from the shadows, making sure they don't linger too long, ensuring they leave before sunset. Most of them do, sensing something that makes them uncomfortable even though they can't put their finger on what it is. But occasionally someone sits in one of those chairs and stares into the forest with a look I recognize, the look of someone running from their past, someone desperate for a fresh start, someone vulnerable to the promises of easy solutions. Those are the ones I worry about most. Those are the ones I have to save, because the hunger never truly dies. It only sleeps, waiting for its chance to feed again. And I'll be here, standing guard against the darkness for as long as it takes. The vanishing tenants will vanish no more.